Okay, folks, I think we can get started. My name is Sonu Bedi. I'm an associate professor in government, and I also happen to be the convener for the Dartmouth Legal Studies faculty, which is basically a working group of faculty here that are interested in issues of law. And so today is May 1st. It's also Law Day. Law Day, just so you know, to give a little bit of history, was established by President Eisenhower in 1958, and in 1961, Congress named May 1st Law Day. So it's an opportunity to celebrate law-related events. So we not only have the lecture today of Professor Cole to speak with us, but we also have tomorrow a panel on which Professor Cole will be on, along with Dan Benjamin, Catherine Gilbert, and it will be chaired by Susan Bryson, who has put together a great group of folks, and that's also going to be sort of running with this theme of preserving liberty. I think the title is Preserving Liberty and Security in Fighting Terrorism. And so that's going to be tomorrow from 12:30 to 2 p.m., Haldeman 041. Okay, so hopefully you all can make it there too. Let me give out, before I introduce Professor Cole, some shout outs, some thanks. This event wouldn't be possible without support from the Rockefeller Center, and in particular from Sadhna Hall and Joanne Needham, as well as the Dartmouth Lawyers Association, who graciously give money in order for us to have events like this, and in particular Law Day. I want to acknowledge Gary Brooks, class of 1970, who is right here representing the DLA for our Law Day events. And in particular, I also want to thank Joanne Needham. I know I couldn't do this. She's up there. She makes this look, if this looks easy and looks totally planned and well thought out, it's thanks to Joanne. Okay, the Volk lecture, right, which is what today Professor Cole will be delivering, is a lecture established established on behalf of, or naming Stephen R. Volk, class of 1957. It was established in 2004 by his friends and colleagues. Honoring him, he was chairman of Credit Suisse First Boston, and then formerly of Sherman and Sterling, which is a law firm. And so it was really my great pleasure then to introduce Professor David Cole, who will be giving the Volk lecture today. He is the George J. Mitchell Professor of Law and Public Policy at Georgetown Law School. And actually, if you looked at his CV and printed it out, it's like 18 pages. I'm not going to rehearse all the books he's written. I think that by my count, it's 7 books and countless number of law review articles. I will just say that his most recent book, The Torture Memos, Rationalizing the Unthinkable, was published in 2009. And also, he published an earlier book, No Equal Justice, Race and Class in the American Criminal Justice System. In 1999, it was named the best nonfiction book. I actually ended up reading that book in graduate school at Yale, and I've actually assigned parts of it. I mean, if anyone has studied race, law, and the criminal justice system, they have read this book. So, it's a real pleasure to have Professor Cole with us here today. He received his bachelor's and law degree from Yale University. He is not only a prolific scholar, he's also a litigator. He's argued some of the most interesting and influential cases at the Supreme Court, including Texas v. Johnson, which was the First Amendment flag burning case. And so he's going to be talking to us today about national security. He teaches constitutional law, criminal law and procedure, national security, military, war, and peace at Georgetown Law School. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to bring here Professor David Cole, our Volk lecture for 2014.
Thank you, Sonu, and thank you to all of you who have come on what appears to be the first day of spring in Hanover, New Hampshire. But I'm not fooled by the sunny, beautiful weather. I noted that the when I arrived at the hotel, the Rockefeller Center had left me a gift bag, and in the gift bag there was one gift, and it was a very, very strong umbrella. So I know what to expect. So I want to talk about this question of whether President Obama can end the war on terror, and it is very much a question, but I think it's a really important question and one that is worth all of us thinking about. In some sense, in the most trivial sense, President Obama ended the war on terror a long time ago. One of the first things he did upon entering office was to abandon the use of the term war on terror, and instead the Pentagon substituted the term overseas contingency operations. But for some reason, overseas contingency operations doesn't have the same ring as war on terror. And so, notwithstanding that the president sought to end it, at least linguistically and rhetorically, it continues. But of course, what he has not ended is the war with Al-Qaeda, which is really what the war has been, more or less from its outset, notwithstanding President Bush's choice of the broader term of the war on terror. It was always a war with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces. That was the enemy that Congress authorized the use of military force against in the first weeks after 9/11. And I think one thing is clear, and that is that President Obama does want to end the war with Al-Qaeda. And I think you get that from comparing the two speeches that he has made on the subject of terrorism, national security, the rule of law, and civil liberties since taking office in 2009. The first was in May of 2009, and it was a very important speech, but it was not a speech about ending the military effort against Al-Qaeda. It was a speech that sought to distinguish the way in which he would respond to terrorism and Al-Qaeda from the way that his predecessor sought to approach terrorism and Al-Qaeda. And namely, the bottom line is, I will continue to fight for our security and against Al-Qaeda, but I will do so within the frame of the rule of law, within the frame of the Geneva Conventions, within the frame of the Constitution. I will not seek to put all of that to one side, as my predecessor did, and we're a stronger country if we respond in a way that is consistent with the rules that govern both a law enforcement and a military response to terrorism. But his 2013 speech, almost 4 years to the day from the first speech, which was given, the 2013 speech in May was given at the National Defense University, had a very different theme. The theme was really about ending the war with Al-Qaeda. He talked about we cannot maintain a perpetual state of war, that our democracy demands an end to this perpetual state of war. And it seems clear that President Obama would like for his legacy to be the president who ended 3 wars. He's already pulled the troops out of Iraq. He's committed to pulling the troops out of Afghanistan this year. And the third war is the war with Al-Qaeda, because of course the war with Al-Qaeda overlaps with the conflict that has been going on in Afghanistan, but it is not limited to Afghanistan only because Al-Qaeda doesn't limit itself to Afghanistan. It has spent much of its time in the mountains in Pakistan, but Al-Qaeda associates and affiliates have also been found in Yemen and Somalia and various other parts of the world. And so ending the war in Afghanistan, which will happen, for better or for worse, at least ending our military involvement in that conflict, doesn't necessarily mean the end of the war with al-Qaeda. As long as al-Qaeda continues to exist, the authorization to use military force, which is the domestic basis for the military response to al-Qaeda, says nothing about Afghanistan. It authorizes the president to use military force against those who attacked us on 9/11 and those who harbor them. It's not geographically limited in any way, and nor is al-Qaeda really geographically limited in any way. So ending the war with Afghanistan is one thing. Ending the war with al-Qaeda is another thing altogether. But President Obama, I think, said that he would like to end all three. Now, critics on the left and the right are doubtful about his ability to do this. On the right, the refrain generally is President Obama can't end the war with al-Qaeda. As long as al-Qaeda continues to seek to attack us, the war is not over. And critics on the left say President Obama won't end the war with al-Qaeda because the presidency is, the executive branch generally and the national security establishment won't allow him to end the war with al-Qaeda because the war empowers them, the war gives them more resources, gives them a sense of mission that they're unlikely to want to give up lightly. But I do think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, while not equating with an end to the conflict with al-Qaeda, will, I think, raise the question about ending the war with al-Qaeda in a way that really was not possible until as long as we were in Afghanistan. So many people around the world, in the United States, around the world, particularly in Europe, have been critical from the beginning about the use of a military response to a terrorist act. That's just not the way to go. You don't fight a war against terror. When you do, you make the terrorists into warriors. You respond to terrorism as a crime through law enforcement. That's the better way to do it. That's the more appropriate way to do it. That's the more effective way to do it. That's the more morally correct way to do it. That's a very widely shared view in Europe and among many in the United States as well. But when people said, this isn't a war on terror, that's like war on crime, war on drugs, it's a metaphor, not a war. The response was always, what do you mean it's not a war? We have troops on the ground in Afghanistan being shot at every day. And that was always a pretty good rejoinder to the criticism or the claim that this is not a war, not appropriately understood as a war, et cetera, et cetera. Well, once we have no battleground, once there is no place in which the locus of a battle exists, I think it'll be easier to raise questions about the propriety of a military response to the threat that we pose. So what I want to talk about really is what it takes to end the war with al-Qaeda, number one, and number two, what the consequences, what would it mean to say that the war with al-Qaeda is ended? And I want to talk about the consequences for detention, for killing, and drones in particular, which is our favorite way of killing these days, for surveillance, and for accountability. Because I think it has, shifting from a war footing to a peacetime footing has consequences in each of these four areas. And I think when you see those consequences, number one, you, I think, can see that it is possible to, and conceivable to put an end to the war with al-Qaeda. And number two, that it would be advisable and advantageous to shift to a non-war footing. So the first point is that the president himself can end the war with al-Qaeda. He doesn't need a Congress to enact a statute to declare that the war is over. And that's a good thing, because getting Congress to enact a statute to say anything these days is a major challenge, and will probably be even a greater challenge after the midterm elections. But all Congress has done is to authorize the use of military force. It has not required the use of military force. And it's certainly within the purview of the executive, the commander-in-chief, to say, we are no longer in a situation where I need to use the force that you have authorized me to use. That's his choice. So he can, without getting the blessing of Congress, much less the blessing of the court, declare the end of the war and shift us to a peacetime footing. It doesn't require repeal of the AUMF, although that is a subject that has been discussed by the president and others, and that's important. What I think it takes to the key to ending the war with al-Qaeda is humility and a recognition of our limits, and that's humility is not sort of in the job definition for the President of the United States. Nor recognition of limits is also not generally in the job description of President of the United States, most powerful person in the world, et cetera, right? But that is what it takes, because I think much of the impetus for a war is a sense that we must eliminate the threat, that we cannot tolerate another terrorist act, that we must prevent the next terrorist act from occurring. And immediately after 9/11, John Ashcroft gave a name to this. He called it the paradigm of prevention. And the idea was, it's not enough to use law enforcement tools that allow us to capture a terrorist after the bomb has gone off. We need to prevent the bomb from going off in the first place. And that paradigm of prevention is what authorized the use of military force, authorized torture, right? No one, not even John Yoo, not even the David Addington, not even the most pro-tough tactics people in the Bush administration ever argued that torture was justified on retributive grounds, that we can torture someone because he engaged in a terrorist act against us, to punish him. The justification was always preventive. It's justified to use these tactics because they will help us get information that allows us to prevent some future terrorist attack from occurring. It's the preventive justification that makes torture even thinkable. So as long as you're in a preventive paradigm, as long as the mandate is to stop all terrorist acts from occurring, you're very likely to move to a military response, and it's very hard to step back from that military response. To step back from that military response requires recognizing that terrorism will always be with us, always has been with us. If you take the position that President Bush took, which is this is a war on terror, it's a war against all terrorist groups of global reach, well, then you're talking about a permanent state of affairs. If you take the position of John Ashcroft that we must prevent every terrorist act from occurring that targets us anyway, you're very likely to engage in a military military response. But if you recognize terrorism is an unfortunate fact of human existence, that people with grievances will engage in violence to make their political points, particularly against powerful forces in society, and that is always going to be the case, that you can't extirpate terrorism from the face of the earth, and you can't extirpate Al-Qaeda from the face of the earth. Al-Qaeda is more of an ideology than it is an organization. All it takes is two people to be inspired by a website and create an Al-Qaeda organization, and there you've got an Al-Qaeda. We're not going to eliminate Al-Qaeda just as we're not going to eliminate terrorism, but that doesn't mean that you can't end the war. You end the war when you recognize that we should and can respond to the threat of terrorism, the threat that continues from Al-Qaeda, through managing the risk rather than preventing all terrorist acts, through a law enforcement response rather than through a military response. And President Obama has already, I think, recognized this. This is from his 2013 speech. He says, "Neither I nor any president can promise the total defeat of terror. We will never erase the evil that lies in the hearts of some human beings, nor stamp out every danger to our open society. We must be humble in our expectation that we can quickly resolve deep-rooted problems like poverty and sectarian hatred." That recognition, it seems to me, is critical to moving off of a wartime footing. All right, so what would it mean if we moved off of the wartime footing in terms of the kinds of tools that we have to respond to the threat of terrorism? Here I want to talk, as I said, about four issues: detention, killing, surveillance, and accountability. And the point with respect to both detention and killing is that moving from a wartime footing to a peacetime footing does not mean the end of detention, does not even mean the end of killing. What it means is the end of status-based detention and the end of status-based killing. So, to take detention first. In wartime, one can detain those who are fighting for the enemy against you. That's what nations have always done in wartime. It's one of the ways that you incapacitate the enemy is by detaining them. You don't have to try them for a war crime. We detained hundreds of thousands of people during World War II. Very small number of them were charged with war crimes. So the notion that you must try them or release them, that's not recognized in wartime. Detention based on status, based on a person's relationship to the fighting force that you are engaged in an armed conflict with, is a justification for detention during wartime. Detention during peacetime can't be based on status. There's no justification to lock people up based on who they're associated with in peacetime. It has to be based on acts, and generally criminal acts. If somebody engages in criminal acts, they can then be detained, incapacitated, by proving that they engaged in a criminal act against you. And that's a significant difference, but what it underscores is that detention remains a possibility for those who threaten us as long as we can prove, in peacetime, as long as we can prove that they have done something wrong. So here the issue, of course, is Guantanamo. What do we do with the people at Guantanamo? And here, too, I think President Obama has made it clear that he wants to move from this wartime footing that, in some sense, justifies the continuing detention of the people at Guantanamo to a peacetime footing. And here's what he said. He said, "I know the politics are hard, but history will cast a harsh judgment on this aspect of our fight against terrorism and those of us who fail to end it. Imagine a future, 10 years from now or 20 years from now,
when the United States of America is still holding people who have been charged with no crime on a piece of land that is not part of our country. Look at the current situation where we are force-feeding detainees who are being held on a hunger strike. Is this who we are? Is that something our founders foresaw? Is that the America we want to leave our children? Our sense of justice is stronger than that. Now, those are not the words of somebody who, wants to soundbite to appease the left. I think those are the, and he had, some of you may recall, he had a press conference shortly before this speech in which he was kind of off the cuff, made similar, very, very impassioned remarks about the injustice of continuing to detain the people at Guantanamo. So, and of course, President Obama, on his first day in office, promised that the people at Guantanamo, not that the people at Guantanamo would be released, but that Guantanamo would be closed within 1 year. And he has obviously not succeeded in meeting that promise for a variety of reasons. But what would it mean for these people? And is the fact that we have these 150 some now Al-Qaeda, Taliban detainees at Guantanamo, does that require us to continue the war in some way? Well, as I said, there's about 150 people there. More than half of them have been cleared for release already, meaning we are comfortable sending them back to the country from which they came pursuant to certain conditions. Many of those, about 50 some of those, are from Yemen. And the concern is that the Yemeni government is not sufficiently, the security system is not sufficiently secure to return them at this point, but they're releasable if we support the Yemeni government to the point where the conditions are satisfactory. There are another small-ish number of people who can and will or are being tried for some kind of crime and will then, if convicted, be probably sentenced to very long prison terms. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is right now in a military commission with a number of the other co-conspirators behind 9/11. And if that ever gets to conclusion, I'm confident that they will have a conviction and he will be locked up, but not in a preventive detention mode, not on a status-based mode, but based on what he did and his responsibility for 9/11. Then there are a core. So some people can be released and we've already identified them as releasable. That shouldn't be that big a deal to release them. And others we've identified as people we can try and we're, I guess, relatively confident we can convict. And so they shouldn't be a problem. But then there's a core of about 45 now, it was originally 48, now 45, who are identified as too dangerous to release but too difficult to try. And so what do you do with those people? Under wartime authority, you don't have to try them. You can detain them because they're part of Al-Qaeda and you've determined that they're too dangerous to release. There's nothing wrong with that. Under international law, there's nothing wrong with that according to the Supreme Court under our domestic law either. But if you end the war, well then you can't continue to detain them based on their status. And if you can't try them, well then you're going to have to release them. So some people say we can't end the war because we can't release these 50 people. They're too dangerous to release. But that clearly, is the tail wagging the dog, right? The existence of an armed conflict authorizes detention of those who are fighting against you. The desire to detain people who you think are dangerous does not justify war. Right? We can't say, well, because we want to continue to detain these people, we have to keep the war going. That's just not justifiable under any theory of just war. So we would eventually have to detain, to release those individuals if they can't be tried. So what do we do with them? Well, some of them may well be detainable by the countries from which they come. You know, a lot of these people are not particularly popular in the countries from which they come either, and so they may be detainable in those countries, in which case they don't pose a threat to us. Some, though, will not be, and they will continue to pose a threat to us, presumably. But my response to that is, so what? There are already hundreds, if not thousands, of suspected terrorists, Al-Qaeda affiliates, members, associates around the world who pose a threat to us. And we don't detain them all. We watch them, we surveil them, we work with their home governments to make sure that they are kept in check, and when and if they engage in some kind of illegal action, then we take action against them. And we would have the same power and authority to do that with respect to these individuals. So yes, it's a risk, but it's a risk that we're already tolerating with respect to hundreds, probably well over 1,000 other identifiable individuals who we are very concerned about as being dangerous and yet are not detained. And as soon as those individuals who we would, keep an eye on engage in some kind of hostile conduct against us, then we could arrest them, then we could try them, and then we could detain them based on that conduct rather than based on status. But status-based detention is not permissible in peacetime. Drones. Similar point with respect to drones. So in wartime, drones are a form of killing. And killing is not illegal during wartime. It's an unfortunate fact of war that people kill each other, but it's not illegal. There are limits on who you can target, under what circumstances, proportionality, collateral damage, necessity, a host of constraints on killing, but killing is not off the table. Killing is not off the table. And one of the things that has I think is a puzzle is how and why drones have become in some way for President Obama what torture was for President Bush. Just as the world condemned President Bush for torture, the world has condemned President Obama for drones. And in some respects, that's curious, right? Because, as I said, killing is part of wartime. And targeted killing is better than untargeted killing. Untargeted killing is what bombing is. Drones are, at least when they work, a much more discreet and surgical way of targeting the enemy and limiting collateral damage. So why do they have the same sort of, raise the same kind of controversy around the world that torture did under President Bush? Torture, we can understand why that's controversial. Torture is, under the Convention Against Torture, absolutely prohibited under all circumstances, specifically including wartime. It is just not an option. You can fight a war without torturing. You can't fight a war without killing. And yet, the drone policy has been almost as controversial as the torture policy. Well, I think there's really 4 reasons why the drone policy has raised as much concern as it has. And they are, first, the secrecy surrounding the program. The notion that we can go around the world killing people and not even acknowledge that we are doing it. Indeed, I don't know how many of you saw this, but this week, on the 10-year anniversary of the disclosure of the Abu Ghraib scandal, the Senate dropped a provision in the Defense Authorization Act that would have required the administration to report on the number of people it has killed with drones each year. And the administration was not even willing to report on the number of people it has killed. It wants the authority to kill people without even having to say how many we have killed. Not who we've killed, just how many. They don't even want to have to do that. And the Senate acceded to the administration's opposition. That kind of secrecy is deeply problematic. Deeply problematic. Now, many people say that secrecy was a necessity because in order to use drones, for example, in Yemen or Pakistan, we have to get Pakistan or Yemen's approval, and both Pakistan and Yemen say to us, we'll let you do it on the condition that you would not say that you're doing it. Keep it a secret. And so then we turn around and say to the American people, well, we can't, acknowledge one way or other whether we're doing it because that was a condition, right? Otherwise, it would be a violation of Pakistan's sovereignty if we did it in Pakistan without their approval. So we need their approval, and they say, we'll only let you do it if you don't admit to doing it. Well, why do they say you'll only let you do it if you don't admit to doing it? Because what government in the world could say to its people, we just gave another government the power to kill people by remote control in our country? Right? Imagine if President Obama gave any other nation the power to kill people in the United States by pressing a button in their country. He'd be impeached in a second. Right? It's just, and so the secrecy is because an open agreement along these lines would be untenable. And I think that raises some serious moral questions about entering into such an agreement in the first place. But the secrecy surrounding the program, I think, creates real concerns, and for good reason. And President Obama, to the Obama administration's credit, it has become more transparent about the program over the course of his administration, through, I think, a lot of infighting within the administration between those who favor transparency and those who insist on secrecy. But it's still far too secret. Second, it's exceptionalism. All right, we would not tolerate a world in which other countries were deploying drones to kill people in other countries in the way that we are. We just wouldn't. We tolerate this policy because we have the technology and almost nobody else has it yet. Right, so it's an example, yet another example, unfortunate example of American exceptionalism. It's also, I think, in a way, it's an example of imperialism. What's more imperialist than killing people in another sovereign's nation by pushing a button in your own nation? The exercise of sovereign power in somebody else's backyard doesn't look good. People don't like to see that. And then I think fourth, there's a real concern that drones make it too easy to kill, that they reduce the disincentives to resorting to lethal force. It used to be that if there was somebody in Yemen who we were concerned about, we had a number of options. We could send troops in. We could drop a bomb on his house. We could work with the Yemeni government to try to capture him. But we could watch him. We could have the Yemeni government watch him. But we were very unlikely to send troops in, to send special ops in, to drop a bomb on his house, right? Because those are costly. Those are costly measures. But if you can push a button and engage in a surgical strike that has some plausible or implausible deniability and doesn't put any boots on the ground, well, suddenly the use of lethal force seems less costly and therefore more tempting to resort to. And I think that too has raised legitimate concerns about the drone policy. But drones are just killing, and killing during wartime is justified as long as you're killing the enemy and you're doing it in proportional ways and you're doing it in ways that are consistent with the laws of war. Well, what happens during peacetime? Do we give up the ability to eliminate a terrorist threat through a drone strike if we go to a peacetime footing? Well, we do eliminate the ability to kill somebody because they're a member of Al-Qaeda or a member of an Al-Qaeda associated force, but we don't give up the authority to use lethal force to respond to an actual imminent threat of attack that cannot be countermanded in any other way. in peacetime, a nation is permitted to resort to force in self-defense, as long as it faces an imminent threat, as long as that threat cannot be countermanded in any other way, as long as force is used as a last resort, proportional, necessary, etc. So it can be used, but it can't be used based on status. It has to be used on the fact that somebody actually is engaged in an imminent attack on us. Well, what does President Obama say about this? In his 2013 speech, he says, we've now adopted a set of rules on when you can use drones. And there were some articles in the paper how before the election against Romney, the Obama administration was, madly trying to come up with rules on the drone program because, oh my God, Romney might win the election, and then it would be Romney pushing the button. So we need rules. And then when Obama won the election, that program got, put on the back burner. We don't need the rule. But they did eventually adopt rules. And here are the rules, according to President Obama. He will authorize non-battlefield drone strikes, and realize after we pull out of Afghanistan, there will be no battlefield. Only where, one, they are necessary to respond to individuals who pose a continuing and imminent threat to the American people. 2, capture is not feasible. 3, the host country is unwilling or unable to countermand the threat. And 4, there is a near certainty that no civilian will be killed or injured. Now that standard is consistent with international law. In fact, in some ways, that near certainty that no civilian will be injured or killed goes further than international law. International law allows you to use force in self-defense even if there's collateral damage, as long as you limit it. With drones, you can limit it, at least in theory, you can limit it very sharply, and so that may be the explanation for the near certainty standard. But the point is, he's already imposed on his administration the very limits that would exist in peacetime. So declaring an end to the war on terror would not, or the war with Al-Qaeda would not tie our hands in ways that the president has said, anyway, that he's already willing to tie his hands. Now, there are many, many questions that remain about the drone program. It's still not sufficiently transparent, and so we don't really know what imminent really means, and it seems that they've reinterpreted imminent in a way that is deeply problematic. Feasible, capture is feasible, that also is a serious question. And without transparency, we can't know whether he's actually following his own restrictions. But those restrictions are ones that he says he's able to live with, and so if that's the case, we should be able to move to a peacetime footing. Finally, and more briefly, surveillance and accountability. So surveillance is a complicated one, I think, for a couple of reasons. First of all, as we know, thanks to Edward Snowden, we now have a surveillance regime that was beyond, even our best science fiction novelists' feats of imagination. I mean, just an incredible ability to monitor and gather and collect and analyze with computers data about the private lives of people around the world and at home. And the NSA has been deploying it in a very aggressive way, and understandably in an aggressive way. They are the National Security Agency, after all. They're not the National Civil Liberties Agency. I was at an event yesterday where James Bamford, who's sort of written 3 books on the NSA, was speaking. He said, when he first started writing about the NSA, the joke was that the NSA stood for no such agency. It was that secret, right? That he wouldn't even acknowledge that it existed. He said now the notion in the NSA itself is that NSA after Snowden stands for not secret anymore. But the NSA has deployed, and in the wake of 9/11 and in response to the threat of terrorism, deployed a massive technology of surveillance, most of it directed around the world, but some of it also capturing our own activities in ways that I think are quite disturbing. But what would the end of the war with Al-Qaeda mean for the NSA? Well, one point is that none of the authorities that the NSA is acting under are triggered by war. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, for example, and the executive order that governs international surveillance, they're nothing about war in them. They exist, those authorities exist in peacetime as well as wartime. We need to know what the world is doing, whether we're at war or not at war. And so those authorities to gather foreign intelligence, not to gather wartime or military secrets, but to gather foreign intelligence, which is broadly defined to include essentially anything about that might influence our decisions about foreign policy. So, what isn't in that bailiwick? Those authorities exist in the same fashion in peacetime as in wartime. So the end of war will not solve the problem of an over-aggressive NSA from a legal standpoint. But I do think that from a sort of practical and political standpoint, it helps. Because even if war is not the technical legal trigger for these incredibly aggressive actions, it is a practical and pragmatic incentive. We spend more money, we devote more resources to surveillance and intelligence in wartime than we do in non-wartime, and understandably so. And in wartime, it's harder to argue for putting constraints on that information because, after all, it might save a life of a soldier. In peacetime, it's easier to make the kind of trade-off decisions that need to be made if you want to live in a world in which we have the benefits of online activity and we also preserve some measure of privacy and human dignity. I think those debates, which Edward Snowden has really kicked off, are possible, and because we've moved already in some psychological way off of a war footing, and will be more possible if we actually move off of a war footing. Finally, accountability. This is something that I've been critical about with respect to the Obama administration from the beginning. I was critical of the Bush administration too. We have had very little accountability for the war crimes that we committed in the name of our security in the wake of 9/11. And there's no doubt that we committed war crimes. There's no doubt that torture is a war crime, and there's no doubt that we authorized torture at the highest levels. And yet, no one has been held accountable. Accountability during wartime, though, is a hard thing. And particularly when the targets of some of the most extreme and egregious actions are people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Not easy to have an accountability mechanism in place when you're in a war and your target was one of the leaders of the enemy. And so it's often the case that accountability comes later, comes in retrospect, comes after, and often long after the war. I mean, think about the detention of Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II. During the war, it was upheld by the Supreme Court as constitutional. It wasn't until 40 years later that President Ronald Reagan signed into law a formal apology and reparations to the people who we illegally interned. And that was only the result of 4 decades of work by civil society, by Japanese American groups and the ACLU to try to rectify the wrong of Japanese internment. So that accountability took a very, very long time. So once the war is over, it may be more possible to have a meaningful form of accountability. And I think I don't expect, and I've never really advocated criminal prosecution as the appropriate form of accountability in this context, but I do think that some formal kind of commission, some formal inquiry is an appropriate form, and we've had that actually. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has conducted a 3-year, multi-million-dollar inquiry into the torture program, written a 6,300-page report with the longest executive summary known to mankind, 600 pages. I was always taught an executive summary has to be 1 or 2 pages at most, but not if you're the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The only problem with that form of accountability is that, that it's entirely secret. And no one has seen it except for the people who have security clearances and privy to it. The public has not. But President Obama has, the Senate Select Committee has said that the executive summary should be disclosed, and President Obama has said that he thinks it ought to be disclosed as well. And so it may, before he leaves office, be disclosed. And that, I think, will be some form of accountability. So, in conclusion, will the president end the war with al-Qaeda? I think it's clear if you go through these steps, he can end the war with al-Qaeda. It's within his authority. It would not tie our hands in any unacceptable way, and it would put us on a better footing going forward in terms of our ultimate values. So he certainly can do it. Will he do it? I think that's not really a question that I can answer. Only the seers who the Justice Department kept in the basement in Minority Report. They're the only ones who could really, tell us whether he will do it. But I will say that I think he will only do it if there's significant public demand for it, or public backing for his desire. I mean, we don't have to convince President Obama, but I think we do have to convince the many in the administration that this is something that's politically acceptable. And there I'm somewhat, skeptical. This is not a war that imposes costs on most of us. Our children are not, for the most part, our children are not fighting. There's no draft. There's no, there is a cost in terms of the incredible amounts of money that we're spending, but we don't really see that, along with all the other things that our taxes go towards. And so it's not the kind of thing in which there are going to be protests in the streets to stop, like Vietnam, where we had a draft. But that only underscores how important it is for civil society organizations that are committed to the values that are most imperiled by this military footing. Engage and focus and advocate for the end of the war on terror. Groups like the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, CARE, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, all of these groups, which are basically groups of people committed to the very values that are most threatened by the continuation of the war. But I'll conclude with President Obama quoting from James Madison, who gave the best reason for why we should be pressing to end the war. And James Madison said, and Obama quoted him in his speech in May, that no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions, and there's a person with a microphone who will come and so that you're equally mic'd to me. But if you put your hand up, I'll call on you. I mean, I'm a law professor, so I'll call on you even if you don't put your hand up. But.
So I was just wondering if you could expand on the terrorism has always existed, terrorism always will argument.
Well, I mean, I don't think terrorism is any, it's not an invention of modern society. What is terrorism? It's the use of violence for political ends against innocent civilians. When has that not been a tactic that individuals, organizations, and even states have used? I don't think there has been a time when we haven't seen people engage in desperate acts to try to make their political points, and to do so by targeting civilians. And it's not just it's not just individuals and organizations. States themselves use terror and target civilians to spread fear and the like. So I just think it's a myth to think, an illusion to think that somehow it's gonna be ended. And if we continue to sort of insist on that as the end point or the goal, then it is true that we will be in a state of perpetual warfare. And so what I think it takes is a recognition that that's a risk, that terrorism is a risk. So are natural disasters a risk. So is organized crime a risk. So is massive drug distribution a risk. So is global warming a risk. These are all things that we need to respond to, we need to manage, but we can't eliminate. And once we sort of recognize that and you put it in the range of all the things that we need to be concerned about, then I think you're likely to adopt a more sane policy, and you're less likely to adopt the kind of extreme measures that we have unfortunately seen adopted in the war on terror. Yeah, right here.
So I heard of an incident where...
Wait for the mic
Thank you.
because this is, of course, recorded for posterity and the NSA, and they need
I heard of an incident where 2 al-Qaeda terrorists were hiding in an African country. I believe it was Libya, and I think that because the U.S. had to go through diplomatic channels to gain access to that country and to target these terrorists, the newspaper leaked this, and I believe they got away. And I was just wondering, how would you propose, balancing the sort of the secrecy, and especially when you're trying to coordinate with other countries and their diplomats, and you have to be forthcoming about your intentions.
Yeah. So first of all, yeah, sometimes people will get away if you can't kill them. That's true. That's true of bank robbers. It's true of serial killers. It's true of rapists. It's true of terrorists. It's a cost to a rule of law society, right? So, and again, I think we have to accept that. We accept that domestically. I'm not sure why we shouldn't accept it, in Yemen or Libya as well. Secondly, with respect to transparency, I don't take the position that secrecy is an evil or that secrecy is never justified. Of course, secrecy is important, and there are all sorts of reasons why you don't want to make public your actions at a particular time. So, for example, when we are, investigating the mob in New Jersey, we don't make public who our informants are, right? We don't make public who we're wiretapping, right? We keep that secret, because if we made it public, it wouldn't be effective anymore. The informant would be dead in the bottom of the river, the wiretap would be down, right? So that's legitimate, right? But we don't keep it secret forever. We don't kill people and then even refuse to acknowledge after the fact that we killed them. We don't refuse even to report on the number of civilians that we have killed, in these types of actions. So I think, I think there's a place for secrecy, but there's also a place for accountability. In a democracy, you have to have both. And we have come, I'm concerned that we have come in the modern age to a situation in which we've essentially reversed what's necessary for a robust democracy. What's necessary for a robust democracy is a transparent government so that we can know what our representatives are doing in our name, so that we can call them to account, vote them out of office, lobby them, etc., if we don't like what they're doing. And privacy for the citizenry, so that we can have the space in which to develop as human beings, in which to have intimate relations, in which to engage in political associations and discussions and the like that the government might not like. That's what's critical for a robust democracy. And we seem to have a situation now where the government insists on transparency from us and secrecy for it. And that is, to me, the end of an accountable government and the end of a functioning democracy. So I think we've just gone in a very, very dangerous direction. But that doesn't mean that there aren't appropriate places and times at which you are secret about the activity. It's perfectly legitimate to be secret about troop movements, right? And it's perfectly legitimate to make it a crime to disclose troop movements. So secrecy has its place. It's just that it's gotten out of control. I have one down here, and then I have So why don't we start down here?
You started to answer my question a little bit, but since you're talking about the NSA not being triggered by war, and so it seems like even if we are in peace, it's not going anywhere, and especially with discoveries made with the leakers and so on and so forth, what kind of accountability mechanisms would you like to see to create that more robust democracy? What direction do you think we're going in right now, especially with what we've learned through what was revealed by Edward Snowden, and what direction do you think we would hopefully go on? Do you think do you have any particular policies in mind or ways that we could create the kind of accountability and robust democracy that you're talking about?
So, I think this is the, one of the defining questions for the next, generation at least, and that is how we put sufficient constraints in place to preserve privacy in the digital era. And the NSA is sort of the poster child for this problem, but it's not limited to the NSA. The Supreme Court just heard a case this week on whether the government can, whether the police can search your cell phone when they arrest you. Because the court has long ruled that when they arrest you for anything, jaywalking, traffic infraction, shoplifting, marijuana use, they can automatically, by virtue of that arrest, search your person and anything on your person and the area within your control. And so they can search your clothes, they can search your wallet, they can search your backpack, they can search, whatever you have. And they don't have to have any justification other than the fact that they're arresting you. So now the question becomes, well, when you have a smartphone, can they go through the entirety of your smartphone because they've arrested you for jaywalking? Should they be able to read all of your emails because you got arrested for smoking marijuana? And that was not a question that the court ever had to address before. And that was not a question that society ever had to address before because there weren't smartphones. And it was, the amount of information that people had on them when they got arrested was limited. Now it's not limited. Now you have, there's probably more information in this smartphone about me and my personal life and my thoughts and interests and et cetera than there is in my entire home, right? So that raises some, really serious questions, right? And the NSA is similar, right? It's only in the last couple of decades that it was even conceivable that the government could get data on every American's every use of the phone. It was just not, the phone companies collected data on people making phone calls for billing purposes, but they were like paper records, and what would be the use of having all these paper records? What would be there would be no possibility to collect everybody's phone records until we created computers that had the ability to turn all of this data into digital form, which is then storable in massive quantities in small places on thumb drives and the like, and searchable without having to send 3,000 agents down to read through lots of pages of phone numbers. We just send a computer in and run a program, and it immediately does what was literally impossible to do. So it's that which has made has created these questions. The same thing with respect to most of the information that the NSA is gathering. It's third-party information in the sense that it's information that we share with somebody else. When we go on the web, when we buy something with a credit card, when we search, put in a Google search, when we send an email, when we do a Skype chat, right? We are sharing information with some third-party internet service provider, phone company, bank, credit card company, et cetera. And the rule, the sort of established rule, has been the government can get that because you gave it to somebody else. You don't have an expectation of privacy in information you give to somebody else, because you always have to assume the risk that they're going to turn around and give it to the government. So there's no constraint on the government's ability to get that information. Well, that rule might have made sense, in the old days, but today you can't live in our society without sharing everything about yourself, unless you live as a hermit, and don't have a computer and don't go on the internet and don't have a phone, and right. I mean, otherwise you are sharing everything about your associations, your thoughts, with a third party. So that raises the question now: what should we do about that? Should that mean that therefore the government should be able to collect it all and search it all and mine it for possible suspicious behavior, or should we set up some kind of rules that set limits? As long as the NSA was doing this in secret, there were people, myself included, writing law review articles about how these are risks, that the third-party disclosure rule in the technological age is problematic. I've been, teaching my students about this for years and years and years, but nobody really took it all that seriously in the world at large generally, until Edward Snowden disclosed what the NSA was actually doing. And now the world is taking it seriously. The president is taking it seriously. He was perfectly happy to continue this program as long as it was secret. He inherited it from President Bush, but he did not in any way constrain it until it became public, and now he said he will constrain it in various ways. Congress was perfectly happy to let it keep going as long as it was secret. But now that it's been disclosed, there are 30 bills in Congress to rein it in or end it. The courts were perfectly happy to authorize it as long as it was secret. Now that it's public, one court has declared the program, at least the domestic NSA program, unconstitutional. So transparency is the first step. And then once you have that transparency, you can have these debates. And I think it is the transparency which makes it possible to have the debates. And then there are very hard questions about where we draw the line. But you have to be public about the scope of what you're authorizing the government to do in order to have those debates. Doesn't mean you have to be public about each and every wiretap, right? At least while it's ongoing. But it does mean that you have to have a public debate about the scope of the authority which is authorized. And we've done that in the past. We did it with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was enacted in the wake of the church committee's disclosures of of all the abuses engaged in by the intelligence agencies in the 60s and 70s. And we, you know, it's about secret intelligence, foreign intelligence, and yet we were able to adopt a statute that put limits and created checks through a court and through committees and the like that was designed to keep this in check. What we've now learned from Edward Snowden is that it's been, you know, it wasn't terribly successful in the face of the increased technological abilities of the government to do things that were just not contemplated when FISA was enacted. But you know, I think now it's open to us to draw some meaningful limits. Dan.
David, thank you for being here today. It's good to see you again, and I'm delighted that Dartmouth is fortunate to have one of the most thoughtful critics.
And Dan, you're not going to take it personally that as soon as you started to ask a question, people started to leave, right?
You get used to that around here.
No, it's a beautiful day.
So, as a direct participant in many of the issues that you've discussed, you know, there's a lot we could talk about, but
and a lot we can't talk about.
and a lot we can't talk about. But there is, and we'll get to talk about some of it tomorrow. But I want to take you up on one area that you discussed, which is killing, and to suggest that while I think actually most of the people who work on counterterrorism in the government, certainly at the high level, would like to see us get to the picture you draw of the balance between law enforcement and military means and intelligence means. There is one big problem with your account, and I think you kind of left yourself open to this when you said there's always been terrorism. I think most historians of terrorism would say that there has been killing of others, including innocents, for political reasons forever, but that terrorism is a distinctly modern phenomenon, and it really appears because of changes in technology. And most people date the beginning of terrorism to the appearance of dynamite and the use of bombs, because bombs change the balance of power between those who are protecting order and those who are seeking to upend it. And what has changed in modern times are a few things. One is that the availability of means of destruction that are vastly greater than existed before is a fact. Mm-hmm. And for Al-Qaeda in particular, it is a constitutive element of what Al-Qaeda is, that they sought weapons of mass destruction and that they wanted to kill enormous numbers of people. The dialectic of technology continues, and what continues with it is the persistence of ungoverned spaces and failed states. The United States, the administration is not always great at explaining itself, but the United States does not go around using drones in downtown London. We tend to use these means, in fact, we use these means exclusively in areas where we can't operate, or where, more importantly, the country itself cannot operate, the country in which these things are going on. And the ability of terrorist groups to grow in these ungoverned areas and expand and plot and innovate in technologies is something that I think we have seen is an intolerable fact. And this is not just what happened in Afghanistan, for example. In the 90s, leading up to 2001, we also saw it in Yemen, where we were absent. The government, more importantly, the government of Yemen doesn't control most of its territory. And in the period beginning, the period really came to the fore in late 2001, we saw an effort to blow up an airplane coming into Detroit that emanated from Yemen with the most ingenious bomb anyone had ever seen. It didn't work, but other models of it have. We saw an effort to put virtually undetectable bombs in printers, which we only discovered because of a good intelligence tip. And we nearly had our embassy blown up by terrorists. And this was the emergence of another group with true global reach. And if something wasn't done about it, using status-based strikes, because we can't go around arresting those people, we would have faced another, core al-Qaeda sort of threat. So I think that we can go a long way in terms of limiting the military piece of things, the use of military means, but I'm not sure how we get to the place that you would like to get to, that we all would like to get to, where it's only based on imminent threats, where we can identify the individual players and have that kind of granularity.
Well, those are all good points. I think what I'd say is President Obama has already said that in non-battlefield zones, which include Yemen, he will not authorize a strike unless the individual poses a continuing and imminent threat, unless the individual's capture isn't feasible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he's already adopted a self-defense rationale, and not a status-based rationale, at least on the face of it. Now, I think where what they do, sort of behind, under the surface, is they use continuing and imminent to muddy the waters between on the distinction between status and conduct, because imminent was always meant to mean, there's an actual attack that's ongoing, that they're plotting, the troops are on, are coming together on the border. You can respond. You don't have to wait until they attack, right? And so an imminent threat of attack would at least presumably mean somebody who is engaged in some sort of plot to attack us, and that's a critical requirement of the self-defense theory, because it's supposed to be a last resort. And if someone's not engaged in an imminent attack on us, then even if his capture is not feasible today, it might become feasible tomorrow, or a week from now, or a year from now. And if there's not an imminent reason that we have to respond now, we can wait and we can keep an eye and we can respond later, right? So, but what the administration has said, it appears to have redefined imminent to say that a person who is a leader of a group that has the capability and intention to attack us at some point in the future, and will do so secretly, or will try to do so secretly, that is, won't announce to us that it's going to do it, they pose a continuing and imminent threat, and therefore we can attack them, even if they're... So Anwar al-Awlaki, for example, the American citizen who President Obama authorized to be killed and was killed, was on the kill list for over a year before he was killed. Now, he can't possibly have been posing an imminent threat of attack for a year, right? So they've elasticized and elongated this notion of imminence in a very troubling way, which I think gets them back to the status-based killing. I find that a disturbing redefinition of imminence. We're not the only ones that have bought on to that broader theory of imminence in the modern world, and part of it is in response to the very things you're talking about, the fact that the ability to engage in really very serious attacks has been democratized, and therefore the kind of old imminence criterion for self-defense seems insufficient, and I think that's a real problem. But my sense is, the fact that technology gives individuals the ability to do great damage to us does not justify a perpetual war. That's sort of the end of the matter, and we have to figure out ways in which to manage the risk without being in a state of perpetual war, and I think we can. It may mean that there will be another plane that goes down. It may mean that there will be another bomb that goes off. But that's a threat that you have to live with. That's a threat that they live with in London, they live with in Madrid, they live with in Bali, they live with in the rest of the world. And they don't go to war just because they've been the object of attack, and there are continued threats of attack on them. We have, and I don't think that's the only way you can respond to the technology that threatens us.
well, I think that's a misreading of what those countries did in response and how they looked to the United States to support them in their own efforts in counterterrorism, which were extensive. And again, we can go on for a long time, but I would just say that the fact that Alaki was on the list for a year represents the difficulty in finding him. He had already strapped the bomb onto Abdul Muttalib in December of 2009. So his status as someone who was engaged in ongoing plotting against the United States, I think, was demonstrated.
Yeah, sure, but the fact that someone has committed a crime, even a bad crime, does not allow us to just go and kill him. It doesn't. And the law of self-defense does not say if somebody has engaged in a crime against you in the past and he's hard to find, you can just kill him when you do find him.
No, but it's
That's
also
just
that
not-
he is involved in ongoing plotting.
We're not going to resolve our dispute, and we have tomorrow to continue it. So, are there any other? Oh, I have one down here. Oh, you go ahead. Go ahead. And then I have down here. Yeah.
Okay. If I'm permitted to put a question.
Come to your son-in-law's defense.
Sorry?
You're
No,
coming to your son-in-law's
I'm
defense.
going to speak as a European public international
Oh,
lawyer.
okay, good.
And
Phew.
my question is really whether you don't start influenced too much by American rhetoric. You always were speaking about the war on terror, as of course Bush did it. And Obama, in the beginning, as you quoted it, already distanced himself very clearly from that sort of language.
Yeah.
If you start from public international law, I think so far it's absolutely clear that war is an interstate relationship, war as such. So, and the United States, of course, have not declared war on the organization of Al-Qaeda, never. The United States have acted in self-defense, as you also clearly implied, after 9/11, when at that time the Taliban were the government of the state of Afghanistan. And at that time, I think, although the International Court of Justice is of a different opinion, the US had clear authority to act in self-defense on Afghanistan territory. Then the Taliban government fell, the Northern Alliance, and then, of course, Karzai formally permitted the continuing armed intervention of the United States and the allied forces in Afghanistan. I think that is, in public international law, the background and the legal basis for what happened. And the question to what extent force can be used in completely other areas is, as you very well explained, a completely different issue. And I think it would not change a bit if the armed conflict in Afghanistan would be ended, as it will be, hopefully.
Well, I agree with that. And I use the, it's true. I use the term war on terror too loosely. I'm obviously very critical of it, but it is, for better or for worse, it's the term that has taken hold. But yeah, what I mean is the conflict with Al-Qaeda, and I recognize that under public international law, that very concept is problematic, but it's also something of a reality.
On the drone program, that apparently the military and the CIA is very involved with running the drones. Are there any legal issues about, I thought the CIA, and they were involved in, they have sort of the dirtier history than the military or the NSA.
Yeah.
They were involved in the torture, and are they allowed to be involved in killing during war?
Yeah.
They are?
No. Well, no.
Is there evidence that
there's a huge legal question. There's a very thoughtful and very long article by Philip Alston, who teaches at NYU Law School and was, I think, was he special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings or something? He studied this issue and he wrote a paper that that addresses precisely this. You know, what are the legal consequences of the CIA doing the killing as opposed to the military doing the killing?
You said that you thought with the military is legal as long as there's a war.
Well,
but
yeah, I mean,
CIA,
I think the answer. I mean, I'm not an expert on this in particular, but I think the basic answer is that. I mean, to me, I don't really care that much whether it's the CIA. What letters are on the jacket of the person who's pushing the button. I care that we have good, acceptable, legitimate, narrow constraints on the use of this tactic, whoever's pushing the button, whatever bureaucracy they're from. But, you know, under international law, it's the military that has the legal authority to use lethal force. The CIA is not part of the military. And so they don't actually have authority. They don't have the privilege of belligerency, which the military has. And so if, you know, the CIA engages in killing in wartime, just as if they, you know, engage in spying in wartime, and they're caught by the other side, they can be tried for engaging in crimes, whereas the military can't, if you're talking about a traditional war. So, and people say, you know, it's better to have the military do it than the CIA because the military is trained in a kind of, you know, hierarchical rule of law approach to fighting. That's how they get trained up. They're trained in the Geneva Conventions and all the concerns, et cetera, whereas the CIA is not trained in this stuff, and if anything, they're trained to, you know, get around laws, avoid laws, violate laws, ignore laws, and so it's not the culture that you want engaging in it. And there's been, you know, Obama and and many in the administration have said that they would like to shift the authority over to DOD from the CIA. Apparently, in some regions of the world, the CIA uses the authority. In some regions of the world, the DOD uses the authority. Eventually, the administration would like to shift it all to DOD, but I don't think it's happened yet, and I'm sure Dan could tell us why, or couldn't tell us why.
Well, why don't we end it there and thank Professor Cole?
Thank you.